"Why isn't the sauce thickening?" I asked, nodding to the pot of Kraft macaroni and cheese on the stove in front of me. "You mean the boxed macaroni?" my husband replied, with a hint of exhaustion in his voice. "It's powdered cheese, Jen. It shouldn't need to thicken." My cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. I'd never been a good cook. In fact, I've always been a terrible cook. Thankfully, James is a kind and patient man. He always says that he loves me more than he hates my cooking. He does his very best to hide his displeasure each time I slap a spoonful of overcooked rice or underdone pasta onto his plate, but that doesn't keep me from feeling disappointed in myself. I can't tell you the number of times I've sat across from him at the dinner table and watched solemnly as he tried to disguise the involuntary twitch of disgust on his face at that first mouthful of whatever over-seasoned disaster I'd served him that evening. This evening was no different. I begrudgingly handed James his dinner, overcooked chicken breasts and watery boxed macaroni and cheese. He accepted it without complaint and took his place at the little wooden table in the corner of our small kitchen. "Thanks for cooking, Jen," he said, smiling as he attempted with great effort to cut through his rubbery chicken breast. And I could tell he really was thankful, despite the fact that he could probably find a more enticing meal in any back alley dumpster. "Ah, al dente this evening," he quipped with a chuckle as he scooped up his second bite of macaroni. I didn't deserve his kindness in this regard, although I appreciated it. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed as I thought of ways to improve my cooking. I was becoming desperate. James has always been so supportive of me. The least I could do is learn how to cook him a meal that didn't taste like dog food. I considered, and dismissed, a variety of potential solutions. My father always joked that my mother could burn water, so it would be pointless to ask her for advice. We can't afford private cooking lessons. I've tried to watch tutorial videos online in the past, but the meal still never turned out quite the way it was supposed to. After an hour or so of exhaustive consideration, I suddenly remembered Helga, an elderly Hungarian, or maybe Russian, woman who lived across the street. She was very old and somewhat reclusive. The kids on the street avoided her. They claimed she was a witch. I always thought it was mean of them to say that about her just because she was elderly and maybe a little odd. Nonetheless, she was old enough to be someone's grandma, and grandmas know how to cook, right? Maybe she would have some old Eastern European family recipes to share with me. Satisfied with this thought, I resolved to visit her the next day and ask her for help. I awoke the next morning well after James had already left for work. He usually makes his own breakfast and packs his own lunch, which is probably for the best. I laid in bed, well past my usual wake-up time, watching the sunbeams coming through the gap in the curtain move across the floor. It wasn't laziness that kept me in bed, but nerves. For some reason, I felt intimidated by Helga, and the thought of reaching out to her for help. As mean as they may be, the neighborhood children were correct in saying that she had a rather frightening presence. Summoning my courage, I rose from the bed and set about my morning routine. Hair, makeup, a well-ironed dress. I wanted to make a good impression on Helga. Once I felt satisfied with my appearance, I walked out the front door and started down the sidewalk to her house before I could change my mind. It was a very short walk. Her house stood only 2 down from my own house and on the other side of the street. Standing on the pavement, I noted that the paint on the exterior of her house was chipping. The lawn, if you could call it that, was either dead or dying. I'd driven past her house countless times, but never noticed that it was in a state of disarray befitting of its inhabitant. I started up the stairs on her front porch, recoiling at the abundance of cobwebs surrounding the front door. Knocking lightly on the wood, I expected to wait a moment before receiving an answer. Instead, Helga opened the door immediately, as though she'd been standing on the other side waiting for me to arrive. I'd waved at her from a distance many times and even exchanged shouted pleasantries from across the street, but I'd never stood this close to her before. She had thick, light grey hair which was gathered in a bun atop her head. Her face was framed with deep wrinkles. "Hello," I started. "My name is Jen," she finished. Yes, I'm sorry to bother you, you need assistance," she interrupted again. This startled me. I found her foretelling to be a bit unnerving. but I'd come this far already. Yes, I'm not very good at well, I need assistance with cooking, I replied. Please. I suppose she was satisfied with my stammered explanation, because she fully opened the door and waved her long, too thin arm toward the gut of her house, inviting me inside. I awkwardly shuffled past her in the doorway and headed toward the kitchen table that was visible on the other end of the hallway. I took a seat at her table, which was covered in a very intricate lace tablecloth that resembled the cobwebs on her porch. She followed me into the dimly lit kitchen and sat across from me. A moment of silence hung in the air. I began to fidget in my chair. So, she said, breaking the silence, you're a terrible cook. I was taken back by her bluntness. I'd never actually said I was a terrible cook, although I suppose she lived close enough to me that she may have been able to hear the smoke detectors in my kitchen going off every other day around dinner time. I nodded in confirmation. I want to learn how to cook a nice meal. You know, something that actually tastes good, I explained, lowering my eyes in embarrassment. Ah, your husband is giving you grief, is he? She asked, clearly expecting an affirmative response. Complaining about the meals you prepare, is that it? No, he would never. He's so sweet and tender. I just don't want to disappoint him anymore, I clarified, surprised by the tears suddenly gathering in the corner of my eyes. Once again, I sat in a heavy silence at the kitchen table, hoping for some sort of comfort from the old woman. She hummed, seemingly indifferent to my emotional state. Sweet and tender, you say? Yes, I confirmed through sniffles. She sat silently contemplating for a moment. Fine, she finally said, rising from the table. She patted me on the back a little too hard with her bony palm in what I interpreted as a poorly executed gesture of reassurance. I suppose I could teach you one or more practiced recipes? Oh, thank you. She silenced me with a wave of her palm. I watched as she opened a cabinet above the inexplicably bubbling pot on a stove and began removing items in an attempt to locate something specific. Baking soda, baking powder, pasta, cans of carrots, beets, beans and peas now sat on the counter alongside multiple canisters of herbs and spices. She continued pulling items from the cabinet until, finally, she came upon a very small jar of white powder. It could have passed for salt, but I had the funny feeling it wasn't. Here, she said, thrusting the glass jar into my hand. I will teach you another day. For tonight, sprinkle this in his food before you serve him. He will not be disappointed, I promise. At that, she made an X motion above her heart with a long, yellowed fingernail and chuckled in a manner that I found somewhat unsettling. Nevertheless, I gratefully accepted the jar and attempted to ignore the creeping feeling that I may have made a mistake asking for her help. I mean, sure, she might be a bit strange, but who am I to judge a lonely old woman? I graciously excused myself from her home with a wave, promising to return another day for a cooking lesson. As soon as I stepped off her front porch onto the sidewalk, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Tension released from my shoulders as my muscles relaxed. Not only had I finally found a solution to my problem, but I'd made a new friend in the process. At least I think I made a new friend. Helga was kind of difficult to read. I thought back to our encounter trying to decipher how she may have felt about my visit. I mean, she agreed to help me, so she mustn't be too annoyed with my intrusion. He will not be disappointed, I promise. I remembered her words and smiled at the thought of finally serving my husband a meal worth eating. Before the sun had even set, I stood by the stove fussing over a pot of boiled broccoli. My mind constantly drifted to the mysterious jar of spices nestled in the pocket of my apron. Or what I assumed to be spices anyway. Could also be rat poison for all I know, but I am just desperate enough to trust the old woman completely. Suddenly, the timer on the oven rang out, interrupting my thoughts and causing my heart to skip a beat. I laughed at my overreaction as I opened the oven door to collect a pan of medium rare, or maybe well done, pork chops. I carefully placed the largest pork chop on a dinner plate beside a generous pile of pale green broccoli. As usual, it didn't really look appealing, I gingerly sprinkled a meagre amount of white powder from the small glass jar over the broccoli on my husband's plate. Glancing again at the sad assemblage in front of me, I decided it might be best to just add it all. I dumped the entire contents of the jar onto the plate and mixed it in with the broccoli until it was no longer visible. That should do it. "James," I called into the living room where my husband was watching old reruns of some corny science fiction show from the 70s. "Dinner is ready." I already had both plates ready and waiting on the table by the time he ambled into the kitchen. I sat in front of my own pork chop and tried my best to suppress my excitement as he took his place from across me. "How does it look?" I asked. "It looks like broccoli," he joked in response. He scanned the plate again before picking up his fork and stabbing a soggy stalk of broccoli. I scooted forward in my seat, eager to witness his reaction to the new ingredient. I could feel myself holding my breath as he chewed his first bite. He swallowed and paused, looking a bit surprised. "Wow, Jen, how did you make this broccoli? Did you find a recipe online? It's delicious." Delicious. The word reverberated through my head like a song. Happiness radiated through my body, sending a warm feeling through my stomach. I wanted to jump from the table and dance through the kitchen. Instead, I concealed my overwhelming excitement and acted as normally as I could possibly manage. I watched gleefully as James continued shoveling stalks of broccoli and bits of pork chop into his mouth. "Oh, thank you, James. My words caught in my throat as I noticed his hair was steadily beginning to change colour. His thick, light brown hair was suddenly turning white, starting at the roots and moving quickly towards his scalp. I sat, mouth agape, staring at his head, which was now entirely covered in nearly translucent white hair. "You actually what, Jen?" James prodded, entirely unaware that his appearance had just drastically changed in a matter of seconds. "Your hair," I replied, ignoring his original question. "What? Is it messy?" he asked, attempting to smooth down the stray locks with his fluffy white fingers. No, it's not messy, it's... Oh my God, James!" I yelled, interrupted once again by a sudden change in appearance. He didn't seem to notice that he was sprouting 10 long, wiry whiskers, 5 on each furry cheek. My heart started to pound in my chest. The beating rang in my ears like a gong. I stood quickly from the table, bracing with a hand on the back of the wooden chair as my knees buckled beneath me. "James!" I yelled again. There was no response. He'd suddenly disappeared from my view. "James!" I squeaked, edging myself around the side of the table to the seat where he'd been visible only moments ago. Again, there was no response. I stood in front of his empty chair, gripping the lip of the table with such a force that my knuckles turned white. I hesitated for a moment before slowly pulling the blue tablecloth back. My stomach twisted into knots as the lifted tablecloth revealed a large white rabbit sitting on the floor in between the legs of the dinner table. I felt bile rise in my throat. I collapsed onto the floor beside the rabbit, suppressing the urge to vomit. Hot tears streamed down my face as I stared at this unexpected creature. He stared back with empty black eyes. His cheeks twitched beneath his small pink nose as he investigated his surroundings, sniffing a small piece of broccoli that had fallen to the floor in the commotion. If I didn't know for certain that this rabbit had been my husband only moments ago, I really would have found him quite cute and exceedingly ordinary. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed, pulling the rabbit into my lap. "I'm so sorry," I repeated again and again while patting the rabbit, my husband, on his soft furry head. I continued sobbing, wailing really, on the kitchen floor for what seemed like hours, but couldn't have been more than 30 or 40 minutes. After a while, I managed to calm myself down enough that the tears stopped flowing. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths and sat numbly watching my husband hop around the kitchen floor on his disproportionately large back feet. Hearing him thump, thump, thump about the towel was starting to make me nauseous. Again, I felt the urge to vomit. My thoughts spun in circles as I desperately tried to come up with some solution to get us out of the mess, to get my sweet, loving, normal, human husband back. My mind immediately turned to Helga. That wicked, vile, evil woman. That witch. She did this to him. I don't know why, I definitely don't know how, but I know that she did. Anger bubbled up inside me. I felt my face grow hot and my stomach boil with rage. I grabbed James off the floor and held his small body against my chest as I marched out the front door to face the old woman again. My heart began to race as I stepped onto her dreary-looking porch. It somehow looked even less inviting after the sun went down. I raised my shaking fist to knock on the front door when it suddenly opened before I could complete the task. "Ah, back so soon?" the woman asked in a cheery, condescending tone. The sly smile on her face confirmed my suspicion that she was to blame for this. Not that I really had any doubts before. I wordlessly motioned to the rabbit nestled in the crook of my elbow, afraid I might start sobbing again if I opened my mouth to speak. I tried to look tough, although I'm sure she could tell I was only seconds away from melting into a puddle on her doorstep. "What?" she asked, feigning ignorance, as if this was all one big game to her. "You asked me to teach you how to make a tasty meal, didn't you?" I nodded, tightening my arms around James and pulling him closer to my rapidly beating heart. "Well, rabbit stew is my favourite." Thank you for watching this video. If you want to support this channel, we have a link in the description for that. Don't forget to give a subscribe, a like, and press the bell to get notifications. Tell us your thoughts in the comments section. You can also send us your real or fictional horror stories.